and welcome to the 1%ers Performance Podcast, coming to you from Combermary and Gadigal country in Australia. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we acknowledge the First Nations people of these lands. This is the podcast exploring how small changes make a big impact. I'm Mario Buchs, and together with my co-host Tim Buxton, we'll discover the unseen edges of peak performance to help athletes, teams and leaders unlock their exponential growth. And now, it's time to dive in and find the 1% that changes everything.
Mario.
Thanks again for having me. Episode 2.
Absolutely. Mate, you've been hanging out in our house. We've come up from Sydney and we get to do a in-person. This is our first of time to sit down, record a couple of episodes together. And mate, kick us off. What are we getting into now in our second part?
Part two of our motivation and drive podcast. What we haven't mentioned yet is heart, the heart, the why, the purpose of whatever we do, whatever endeavor. Like you said in the last podcast, it's very important. Anything we can call an endeavor, organizing our own wedding, helping out at someone else's wedding, working at an aid station, going for a long run, entering a race, starting a new project. So just to recap a little bit, we mentioned the word motivation, which for many people comes along very easy. And it is easy until the 4 a.m. alarm clock goes off. I'm just repeating myself. In the evening, it's like, great, the shirt's there, everything's there. Or the boss gives me a new job to do just on the way out, and I'm fully motivated. And then the next morning, I'm like, wow, okay, where do I start? But you mentioned this very correctly last time. I think people that listen to this podcast, they already know how to put the shoelaces in the shoes and put the shoes on, right? The next part is then actually, putting that one step or that one foot forward. And that's very important. And I think even there, most of the listeners will know, okay, now left foot, right foot, and so on. And when we start the project, then we get into this transition one. We mentioned the analogy with triathlon, it's quite funny because that's a big part. I mean, especially at the top level for these guys and girls, it's like, that's where they lose, And then, look, the last bit of recap would be as well, as we then check in, as we've gone through this transition one, we then need to understand, okay, let's start checking in. And I call them hotspots. And hotspots can be anybody, someone disgruntled at work. Yep. They're not telling you. You need to kind of understand, have that understanding and a little bit of empathy, of course, and bring them in, build a team. The other thing now is not throw everything in the air and hope for the best. So don't employ, so to say, all the teams that you need and all the people that you need. Just take it easy and pick the 1 or 2 or 3 people that you need to get this started. And then we get into the drive phase. Everybody's involved. We pick more people. In an ultra marathon event or in a triathlon, this is where we eat. I know people on the bike, that's where maybe that drive part is. It's the longest part, also in the triathlon, or at least the furthest part, not necessarily the shortest part in time, but that's where also people eat. Right. Then be ready for the marathon that's coming. But moving away from triathloning, then in the middle of an event or a race or a season, correct?
Sport, if it's a team sport.
How much do you want it? And this is also something I speak to my runners and people at work. I says, how much do we want this? There's the end in sight, and I think a lot of people struggle with what comes next. And this is why we've got you. So the question here is, right? You mentioned in the first podcast of these two that maybe you might struggle a little bit not understanding where you are in the middle, because that's just where you are at, but you're good at finishing once you see that light at the end of the tunnel. So just explain to me and the audience where this comes from and how you understand how to get something finished.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it is critical. I mean, what I learned from you in that drive phase, it is critical to make sure you get yourself into position to finish well, right? When I see the finish line, when I can see that I've, there's that, I guess, that adrenaline that starts to kick in, because I know I've seen out a few phases of I can't do this and I've had to rely on that. I like the idea of that gut running. So we talked about the motivation is the mind, the head, lots of energy goes into this excitement of a new idea, and we can try and rely on that too much until we realize, no, we need the systems and processes. And that's where there's a lot more we can drive in the gut. There's a lot more systems here in a human body, just like there's a lot more people and there's a lot more in a team that you can rely on to get you through that middle part. The season of, you think of a football, season, it's really long, 20 odd weeks or however many games or it might be. And there's a lot of different things you're going to have to draw on. And if you don't rely on almost all of those things at one point, you're not going to get to the end where you've actually got a crack at really showing the world your full potential, what you can really achieve. And this is where I think the most important thing is we transition from the head to the gut or the body into the heart. And I like to call this, we talked about the analogy of the run all day transition. This is the why transition. This is the transition where it's like, why did I even start this in the first place? And if you don't have that, not motivation, not drive, if you don't have that purpose, you will not give everything you've got. You'll find a million excuses when the agony of the final surge, you'll get some adrenaline and then suddenly that person will start catching you, or that, things won't go your way in a project and you'll be tempted to be like, oh, well, instead of going, you know what, we got this far, let's give everything we have. And if you don't have that moral compass, that integrity, that conviction that says there ain't nothing now at this point that isn't going to let me put it all on the table and see what I've got. It's also really important as you start entering in this phase to ask yourself the question, did I even have a purpose? And for some of us, right, we actually need to employ that in that transition, that part of the last questioning and the last listening to all the voices and check-ins is this really what I was intending or wanting to achieve? Is this really aligned with my values? Is this really aligned? Because it's going to require a lot from you at this point. And if it doesn't align, it's okay to chalk whatever you've got up to. This is not trying to give you an out in this process, but I think it's really important because this is where a lot of damage can be done. Because if you go into that last phase and you're risking it all and you start to hear a little pain, if it's really not aligned with, you're gonna suffer some consequences, and it's not necessary. You could do yourself some real injury, not only physically. I think relationships get strained. You're gonna have to say to your wife or your business partner, "Hey, I've got to go in 80% here, and it's going to cost you and the people around you." And if it doesn't have the real purpose and meaning for you and for the people that you've got involved, then it's really important, I think, to be honest and true to yourself. And I think we talked about this. This phase is about being true. The first phase that most people, I don't think people listening here are concerned about. The first phase is usually the hardest, the hardest to get started. Most of you are good at doing hard things that are listening. You wouldn't be an athlete, you wouldn't be a high-performing business or entrepreneur if you didn't have an appetite for doing hard things. The critical phase, right, the drive phase, which is where you can actually gain or lose the most in, which I know I need your expertise in. That's the most critical. That's really the most critical phase. But the last phase, we talked about being the most honest, and where you have to be the most honest and true to yourself. And that requires not your head. It doesn't require your gut running. It requires your purpose. It requires your why. It requires your character. It requires your integrity and willingness to be honest and say, it is time. And I don't want to get to the end and say to myself, I wish. There was this one moment, I was a pretty good 800-meter runner in primary school. So a long time ago, grade 7, when grade 7 was primary school, I remember making it to the regional districts. And I'll never forget this moment. I looked over at this other kid who'd kind of made it, who I'd known. We'd raced it a bit before and we were pretty even. And I started to get scared. That those feelings, the butterflies, I started to interpret as, well, you don't want to fail. And I remember making a pact with this kid. I don't know. I think he might have approached me and said, "Hey, let's just not try." How crazy was that? And I entertained that thought. And I remember in 800 meters, there's not pretty much, there's not a lot of middle bit. It's like start and finish. And there isn't much drive, which is probably why I was good at it because there wasn't enough.
And you see the finish, you know?
Yeah. You pretty much, you got one lap and that's it. You know, you've got the start. So that's pretty enlightening right here as I tell this story. I remember 200 meters in, I'm like, what was I thinking? He and I were like, we'd already pretty much guaranteed we weren't going to finish in the top 5. You know, and there's probably only 10 people in the race. Like we'd already guaranteed in 200 meters, we'd lost it. There's a lot to gain. And I remember thinking, stuff that. Like, what have I got to lose? And I remember giving it my everything. I think I got like 4th place or something like that. And then as I was in agony, and, you know, I was one of those guys that would be dry heaving and just on the sidelines when I knew I'd really given it my all. From that point, I thought, I gave it my all for 600 meters. Imagine.
All the way.
Imagine if I didn't, you know, listen to, you know, that silly voice in my head that says, you know, don't even try.
Voices, right? Voices in you have real voices in your project or whatever you do at work, because people are influencing you. In a race like this, you've had a voice before, but you might also have voices during the race. You know, if it's a longer event, you're fighting these, and, you know, and I got to learn to accept these as well. You know, it's quite important. Don't just brush them off. Give them a voice. That doesn't mean they're going to be right, but you need to kind of work with your demons that you've got. And obviously in a comic, you've got the 2 guys on the shoulder, the good guy and the bad guy. When it's a shorter event, right, the drive doesn't actually happen during the event. The drive happens beforehand.
Because the event isn't the day of.
Correct.
The event is the prep.
All the training, right? It's actually, people always get the race and the event wrong. It's not the end all be all. The journey to get to that point. So sometimes the actual race is the finish. So you've got your motivation to start actually training for that or getting yourself set up. If you know, I have friends who've just finished an MBA, you know, and the motivation is there. You get started, then they go through this big, and the pinnacle is obviously the finish line is getting that paper. But sometimes the race itself as a whole is that one where you have that purpose and you have the why, and then you just finish that off. You know, but voices are everywhere. Eh? How many people want to influence us at work? You know, it's like, oh, you know, you're not doing this right. You have to do this and all this. And then there comes not the arguments, but all these little things. So voice is a good point. It's, I think one why is not enough, right? I mean, I'm going to ask you now as the specialist of finishing things. You know, I usually have about 20 or 25 whys, you know, when I start something. Because some of them might fall off in the process, you know, they're not relevant anymore, you know. You know, when I'm in an ultra marathon, for instance, taking the running analogy, I have a lot of reasons why I'm going to finish. And that's not just for me, because for me, finishing is, I finished it and I'm proud and all this kind of stuff. And I'm picking up a belt buckle if it's one of those races. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of people watching as well who want you to do well, right? Your family, your friends, people who are there, they're crewing. And the same goes in a project. You know, the team wants everybody to finish. So if you're the leader of a project, you need to have all these whys, but they have to filter down as well to all your teams. And one why is not enough, I think.
Yeah.
You know, just to get that contract with that big customer. What kind of a why is that?
Well, this is where, and I'll kind of finish the heart, character. Too often people have an agenda, they don't have a why. So they've got it already predetermined outcome they need to see. And those things are what I call expectations. And that is not a why. Listen carefully. If you're listening to this and if you're locked in on an expectation or an outcome in terms of it has to look like this for it to be successful, that's called an agenda or an expectation. And expectations are resentments waiting to happen. Things rarely ever end when you're planning a project exactly the same way you envisioned. However, if you have a purpose, a reason, what I call a why, it's not attached to a specific expected end result. It's attached to something much deeper than that. It can look completely different, but you know deep down within you what motivated you at the beginning, the reason you got into this. And I think that's where you still need to have that growth open mindset, because other people will define for you what success is. The project was successful and you started a podcast, you got all these followers, or you won the race, or you made the finals that year. And this is where life throws you curveballs that you can't control. But what you can control is you can still have not an expectation, you can have expectancy. And that is one of the greatest mindset shifts for people that want to finish something well. Finish with a sense of expectancy, not an expectation of what it has to look like. If you can be like, I do not know where I'm going to end up, I'm going to give my all, and I have an expectancy that it's going to be wonderful. However this thing lands, you can imagine it's like that expectancy. If you're on a plane ride, right? The takeoff's a little shaky, and you're up in the air, and suddenly you get to cruising altitude, and you're just cruising. Then suddenly they come down to land. And when we lived in Iraq, there was this one landing. We watched it today as we were watching Top Gear, the episode, where they come in to land in Erbil, and it has this crazy landing because you're flying over this one city called Mosul, but you can't fly over Mosul because there's surface-to-air missiles that could take these commercial flights out, especially when ISIS was controlling the city and we were living there at that time. So you had to do this gnarly corkscrew landing to get into the Erbil airport about 50 kilometers from Mosul. Corkscrew landing, you're like, what are we doing? Was the hairiest, scariest thing. But there was also this expectancy, and you know that eruption that happens on a plane when finally you land. It might be a little bumpy, it might be a little crazy, but suddenly touch ground you've got there, and people cheer. I don't know, I always hear in America they think that they're on God's country when they land, and surely they are, but us Aussies are a bit too reserved. Probably the Brits and the Swiss and others maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, it stopped a little bit. This whole it's his job to land us safe.
Yeah,
that's the thinking of everybody, really.
But we get in there, and that expectancy is what I think people need to finish with, and it's not tied to an expectation or an outcome or an agenda. It's tied to a purpose and a why. And in that case, the success isn't relied on the outcome. It's I gave it my all. You're going to discover something special about yourself and about your team and the people in that process. So that's how I'd kind of tie up how important that final surge really is.
But look, I think I'll wrap this up here because this is a great way to close. And just something I want to give the audience on the way, the bumpy landing is still a landing if everything's safe. And in the beginning, if a sports team or a team doesn't get the runs on the board or doesn't win all the games in the beginning, that big phase is still that middle part. And that's where the points are. That's where other teams can drop off. So if you look at the ladder, it might change after 2 or 3 weeks again. So never stop believing. Get through the bumpy parts.
Yes.
And I think the end will be in sight at some stage.
You got to trust the process, right? Don't stop believing. Trust the process is the systems. And give it your all. And thank you, Mario. What fun this has been.
Signing out.
Thanks for tuning in to the One Percenters podcast. That's a wrap for another episode. And we're proud to be recording from Australia on Kombumerri and Gadigal country. And we honour the traditions and knowledge of the First Nations people and pay our respects to elders, past and present. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. We want to hear from you, the questions or topics you would like us to cover, and you can easily do that in the Spotify app. And for those of you that are ready to discover your peak performance edge today, just head on over to our website. That is topp.coach. That's TOPP.coach. And start unlocking your unlimited potential with us today. We would love to work with you. And that's it for now. Until next time, what are you waiting for?